I would like to take this opportunity to thank a few people, Professor Sarah Stein and the Levy Center for Jewish Studies for the co-sponsorship of the lecture series. As well, I would like to thank my colleagues at CNES, especially Asli Bali, Susan Slimovich, and Omar Boom for their intellectual leadership and help with organizing this year's series. Also, I wish to give a shout out to our program manager, Joanna Romero, for her logistical support. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Near Eastern Studies at UCLA, CNES is a research hub where over 100 faculty from humanities, social sciences, arts, and law school collaborate in a variety of research and pedagogical projects. Founded in 1957, it is one of the oldest and most distinguished U.S. Centers for interdisciplinary research on Middle East, broadly construed, including Iran, the Persianate world, Turkey, the Arab world, and North Africa. We provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and the dissemination of information within and beyond the campus, offering cutting-edge research and fresh perspectives on the challenges and cultural richness of the Middle East. The center supports graduate and undergraduate instruction over a dozen academic departments, research by faculty, students, and visiting scholars, vital public programming on the challenges facing the Middle East and North Africa, as well as its many cultural and social achievements, and interchange among scholars from around the world, and so on. We are also proud of the fact that our public programs attract people of MENA heritage living in Los Angeles, metropolitan area, and broader audiences with an interest in the Middle East and culture. All our lectures, especially these ones, are filmed and are available on our website. So there's a longevity to these lectures. So please check our website, and you will find all the events and programs for the center, many more to come, especially this quarter. We have lots of events. And in the spring, we'll have a major conference, Levi de la Vida, which is, will honor a distinguished scholar through a long conference. And all our events are free to the public. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Asli Bali, who founded the Averus lecture series on Jewish communities living in Muslim lands prior to the 20th century, with a generous gift from an anonymous donor who I think I can say I should add happened to be a Muslim. Hence the Averus idea and the idea of Andalus as a place of cultural contact where different communities respectfully lived among each other. Professor Bali is a professor of law, the former director of the CNES, and currently the director of Promise Institute for Human Rights. She is a graduate of Williams College, the University of Cambridge, where she was a Herschel Smith Scholar, Yale Law School, and Princeton University, where she earned her PhD in politics. Her principal scholarly interests lie in two areas: public international law, including human rights law and the law of the international security order, and comparative constitutional law, with a focus on Middle East. Her current research examines questions of constitutional design in religiously divided societies. So please join me in welcoming Asli to the podium.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the 6th Averroes lecture. We are extremely grateful to the private donor who initiated this series and continues to make it possible, and for the contribution that it makes to enriching our offerings and drawing our focus to this important area of scholarly research. The series, as Ali just alluded, is named after Averroes, the Latin name of Ibn Rushd, the 12th century Andalusian Muslim polymath, whose philosophical works integrated Islamic traditions with ancient Greek thought. Over subsequent centuries, his commentaries on Plato and Aristotle influenced Jewish and Christian thinkers throughout Europe, among them Maimonides, Thomas Aquinas, Baruch Spinoza, and many others. and the announcement of the Averroes Lecture Series, named for this intellectual, but also named to sort of allude to that legacy and that heritage of Muslim and Jewish intellectual shared traditions, has generated tremendous excitement on our campus as well, fostering new ties between faculty working on Ottoman history, Islamic studies, Jewish studies, Persian history, and broader history of the Middle East and North Africa in several disciplines across the campus. We are delighted that the series is being co-sponsored by the Alan Levy Center for Jewish Studies, which is just testimony to the ways in which this is fostering interdisciplinary collaboration. The multi-ethnic, multi-confessional identity of the Middle East is often obscured when we think of the region in terms of so-called ancient ethnic hatreds. In truth, the region is historically characterized by bonds and ties across religions, tribes, and ethnicities. And by revisiting the histories of Jewish-Muslim relations, we hope to teach our students and our community and remind ourselves of the resonance between the intellectual dialogue and communal exchange that took place across Muslim lands of the past and our own mission as a university serving a diverse student population and located in a remarkably diverse city full of heritage communities. Each lecture features a distinguished scholar of Middle East studies who addresses a facet of Jewish life in the Muslim world from the Middle Ages through the early 20th century. Their presentations are published in an occasional paper series devoted to this lecture, and that can be found on the Center for Near Eastern Studies website that Ali also mentioned. And we are delighted tonight to welcome our sixth Averroes lecturer, Professor Ari Ariel of the University of Iowa. Dr. Ariel's research focuses on the history of Jewish communities in the Arab world and Mizrahi communities in Israel. His talk today focuses on the Jewish community of Yemen and the waves of Yemeni Jewish migration to Palestine beginning in the late 19th century. He will discuss the ways in which Yemeni Jews employed strategies to maintain their connection to Yemen by drawing on Yemeni Jewish cultural practices and immigrant memoirs to unearth the experiences of the migrant community. He uses these sources to interrogate questions concerning Muslim-Jewish relations, Yemeni Jewish identity in Yemen, and how that identity was transformed through the experience of migration and the project of constructing the Israeli state. For a more detailed biography of Professor Ariel, please consult your programs, which also list the upcoming 7th and 8th Averroes lectures that we hope to welcome you to in the spring. I am now absolutely delighted to invite Professor Ariel to deliver his lecture entitled Yearning for Yemen, Migration and Memory. Thank you.
Was just introduced. I want to look at two kinds of sources or sites of memory. Immigrant memoirs, and then I want to sort of shift gears at the end and look at Yemeni popular music today. And I want to do that to highlight two observations. One is that Yemeni memories often run counter to the Zionist narrative of Jewish history and counter to much of the academic literature written about the community by both Yemenis and non-Yemenis. And secondly, these memories indicate the emergence of kind of double consciousness that's manifest in a desire to become Israeli but also to remain Yemeni. Yemeni Jews rejected complete assimilation, but have been aware of the gaze of the dominant European Jewish population and have sought an accommodation with it in Israel, I mean. Likewise, however, they by and large accepted and even embraced Zionism as an ideology, though one based in Jewishness, not in secular nationalism. And I think the later observation is particularly important because Middle Eastern Jewish studies has been tied to political positions. And in recent years, I think there's been a push by scholars on the left, and I broadly include myself in that category, to look for an Arab Jewish position that's opposed to Zionism or even anti-Zionist. And maybe some of the work on the Iraqi Jewish community is a good example of that. But the Yemeni Jewish case doesn't fit that model particularly well. Instead, a picture emerges that's much more ambivalent. Sometimes stories that first appear to run counter to the Zionist narrative are used in Yemeni memoirs in fact to support Zionism, and at other times, sources that appear to be kind of proto-Zionist, I might say, are in fact about life in Yemen and have really little to do, I would argue, with life in Zion, in Jerusalem, or migration to Palestine or Israel. So I want to begin with the story of a Yemeni immigrant. His name is Yeshua Awad, and this is the account that Awad himself gives to a friend of his, Sulaiman Habshush, from a prominent San'ani family. The grandson of Sulaiman Habshush, Yehiel Habshush, who's a businessman and a prolific author in Israel, remembers hearing this story as a child and then includes it in one of his books in 1990. So in 1884, this man, Yeshua Awad, decides to leave Sana'a. He decides he's going to go to Bombay because he wants to be a teacher of Jewish children in Bombay. But he gets to Bombay and he has some trouble finding work. he's right. He doesn't have stable employment, and he decides to pick up again. He goes from Bombay to the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean to New York, and he moves to the Lower East Side so he can be close to a Jewish community. He initially has trouble finding work in New York as well, and also he has trouble being accepted in American Jewish society. He says he tries to join a synagogue that doesn't really accept him, and in fact, even when they're lacking a minyan, a prayer quorum, they don't let him pray with him. So his life is unstable, and he says, if I could return to Yemen right now, I would, but I don't have enough money to do so. So he sticks around in New York, and he soon learns that the rabbi's son is sick, and that doctors in New York have not been able to cure him. Awad apparently had learned natural medicine in Yemen, so he asks the rabbi if he can see the son, and he kind of convinces the rabbi and his wife to let him do so. He discovers that the son has jaundice and manages to cure him using natural medicine, and then miraculously, sort of the community embraces him with open arms. Perhaps the story is a little exaggerated, but he becomes settled in the community. He begins to make a bit of money. But soon, the twist here is the police start asking questions because he's practicing medicine without a license. So the rabbi offers to help him evade the police, but he decides, you know what, I miss my family, I'm going to pick up. He packs his bag, he goes from New York to Marseille, from Marseille then eventually back to Yemen, and resettles in Sana'a. So that's the end of his story. That simple account is striking to me for a few reasons. First, most accounts of Yemeni Jewish migration explain it in one of four ways: messianic impulses, longing for Zion, Muslim oppression of Jews, or increased Muslim-Jewish tension because of Zionism. But this account includes none of those, right? Awad's story is basically the story of an economic migrant. During the 19th century, economic migration was quite common for Yemenis, both Muslims and Jews. The British presence in Aden in 1839 increased traffic in the area and led to the city's rapid development, so you have a lot more people moving around. In 1869, the Suez Canal opens, increasing that further, and greater movement in and around the area create more and more, right, that produces or provokes more Yemeni migration, and Yemenis are going and coming much more frequently. So a visitor in the late 19th century, an Italian visitor, Manzoni, who visits Yemen a couple of times, says that about 1 million Yemenis are abroad in the late 19th century, and that's probably about a quarter of the population. Awad's travel to Bombay, one of Aden's chief trade partners, and then to New York reflects the importance of colonial commercial networks. He probably never understood his movement as a permanent resettling, but instead sought to make money and return to Yemen like many other immigrants, which in fact he did. And Habshush concludes his telling, noting that Awad returned, quote, to Sana'a, the capital of Yemen and the place of his birth and the residence of his family. In other words, he went home. Second, notice that neither Palestine nor Eretz Israel are mentioned in this story at all, right? Almost the entirety of the literature on Yemeni Jews treats immigration or aliyah to Palestine, Israel as the inevitable conclusion of Jewish history. A teleological narrative is created which retroactively places Israel at the center of almost every Jewish act, and thus treats Yemeni Jewish migration as a singular, linear, unidirectional flow to Israel, meaning it's as if Yemeni Jews never went anyplace else. And I am not arguing that migration to Israel and Palestine was not important for Yemeni Jews. Undoubtedly it was, and over the course of the 20th century, Palestine and then Israel becomes the center of Yemeni Jewish life in some really important ways. What I am saying is the singular focus on that migration, to the exclusion of all others, is primarily the result of the establishment of Israel in 1948, and then its center as a place for Jewish migration after that. But projecting this backwards is quite misleading and distorts our understanding of Yemeni Jewish migration. And lastly, not only is Palestine-Israel absent from this story, but I want to stress that this is a story of return migration to Yemen. And this is not an isolated case. Travel logs and literature note the presence of returnees. Yom Tov Semach, for example, who visited in 1910 for the Alliance to consider opening a school in Yemen, notes returnees, and also, in fact, notes that several Turkish businessmen moved to Yemen. So, in fact, it might be an attractive destination country for Jews in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Shmuel Yavnieli, a Zionist emissary who was sent to provoke migration in 1911, encouraged migrants, and is actually worried because some of them are telling negative stories about the Yishuv, and he's worried that they're going to discourage migration. So all in all, the evidence we have suggests that in the late 19th and early 20th century, Yemeni Jewish migrants traveled to various places, creating networks, sometimes commercial networks that include Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and that they often returned to Yemen even after going to Palestine. And just to put this in kind of pictorial form, basically, I'm saying the picture we have of Yemeni Jewish migration looks like this, and it should look more like this, and you could include dots. These are just ones that I happen to be thinking about at the moment. So the picture should be much more complicated. But Hebshush related this story not to challenge our understanding of Jewish migration to Israel or Zionism, but in fact in a book about his experience as an Israeli with family in the United States. The title of the book is The American Dream, and it's intended to address the problem of emigration from Israel to the United States. He describes this yerida, or going down, as one of the most serious problems facing Zionism and the State of Israel. And although he makes it clear that his purpose is not to condemn Israeli immigrants to the United States, and his wife and children are Israeli immigrants to the United States, so that's probably not surprising, but to explain the circumstances that lead otherwise good people and good citizens to leave Israel. The book is made up primarily of letters written to his wife, his observations from time spent in the US, and stories of other immigrants. He puts Awad's story, which he titles The Story of the First Yemeni Jewish Traveler to Reach the United States in 1884, it's a long title, toward the end of the book, despite the fact that it doesn't make much sense chronologically there. In its place, however, it serves as a final reminder that even if immigrants manage to successfully integrate into the United States, their real place is at home. And if Sana'a for Awad was his home, the implication is that Israelis living in the United States should return to Israel. That said, despite the book's quite overt Zionism, and it's quite overt about that at many points, Awad's story challenges Zionist myths about Yemen's isolation and about saving Yemeni Jews. And stories of return migration in particular, I think, again, require that we reassess our understanding of Yemeni history. By and large, the academic literature ignores these stories, although they exist as sort of traces in various sources, nor are they present in the collective memory of the Yemeni community, the Yemeni Jewish community, I should say, which has formed itself in accord with the needs of life in Israel. And I wanted you to kind of consider two quotes to make this story of migration clear. This is from the American Vice Consul at Aden in 1952, who notes specifically Yemeni Jews who earlier opted to emigrate to Palestine and who now wish to return to their former homes in Yemen after having become dissatisfied with life in Israel. Right? Yemeni Jews in Israel as early as 1952, some at least, are petitioning for permission to return to Yemen. The second quote I'd like you to consider is from a 1989 anthropology about Yemeni Jewish women in Israel. And here one of the respondents says, there are those who have come from Romania, Turkey, America who want to return there, but we the Yemenis know. We live here and we will die here. That is to say, we will never return to Yemen. And what I find so striking about these is that if in 1952 some recent Yemeni immigrants were dissatisfied enough with life in Israel to consider repatriation, several decades later this seems like an impossibility. So what happened in the decades after migration, and how is that reflected in the way Yemeni immigrants and others have talked about life in Yemen? I think it's fair to say that Yemeni Jews moved to Palestine and Israel with a fair degree of optimism about moving to a Jewish state. It's probably already clear that I don't believe this story about messianism or about persecution as the main drivers of migration. In fact, I think they're primarily economic, at least the earlier migrations, but they do occur in the context of increased contacts between Yemeni Jews and the Jewish world and of a kind of proto-Jewish nationalism that develops by the end of the 19th century. Arriving in Palestine and then Israel, however, Yemeni Jews were faced with challenges, both because of discrimination on the part of Jews of European descent and because of the hardship associated with moving to a new country and adjusting to a new culture. And I guess it's not surprising that European Jews in Israel in the 1950s had sort of these Orientalist ideas about Middle Eastern Jews. That includes Yemeni Jews, and from the 50s until I would say the present, narratives about Yemeni Jews do two things. They describe Yemen as primitive and isolated, and Yemeni Jews as primitive and biblical. And you'll see how those two things, I think, are linked. But it's worth noting also that the stereotypes of Yemenis specifically were more flattering than those of other non-European immigrants. The fact that the first large-scale Yemeni migration starts in 81, so it's contemporaneous with the first Aliyah, for example, means that Yemeni Jews have greater Zionist credentials than other Middle Eastern Jews and were better organized politically because they migrate earlier. They were stereotyped as hardworking, honest, and content with little. They were also described as preserving the ancient culture of the Bible and possessing the true spirit of Judaism. So, for example, in one of Ari Ariel's now kind of famous articles in Haaretz in 1949, where he explicitly says that North African Jews are primitive and arrogant, ignorant. He contrasts that to Yemeni Jews, who he says have roots in Judaism at least, right? Of course, these seemingly positive stereotypes were a double-edged sword. The idea of being content with little fit well with early Zionist socialist ideology, which stressed asceticism and commitment and sacrifice to the nation, but were also used to rationalize paying Yemeni Jews less than European Jewish workers. Yemeni biblicalness served an important national function. Yemeni Jews could connect European Jews to a national golden age, the time of ancient Israel. Ashkenazi observers sometimes said this quite directly. So here is one quote, and you can get the kind of Orientalist language here. Their traditional cleanliness, piety, their lilting speech, their grace and beauty gave Jews from Western lands a feeling of being linked directly to the time of King Solomon. Sometimes they even note that this is emotional, and this is from a journalistic account in 1952, where Soma Barrera says specifically this was an emotional experience. To talk with the Jews and hear of their experiences was like being taken back through time to be present at a biblical epic, with the original cast come to life against the modern setting. Right? So the idea is these Yemeni Jews, these biblical figures, can connect modern Jews to the Bible. And it's worth saying that early European immigrants did the same thing with Palestinian Arabs, and specifically with the Bedouin population. They thought of themselves as biblical and as native, and they therefore emulated some of their practices to make themselves native. As political tension, however, increased in the 20th century, it became expedient from the perspective of Zionist ideology to remove some of those cultural items from Palestinian or Bedouin origins and to attribute them instead to Middle Eastern Jews. So, for example, the case of Yemeni falafel is I find quite fascinating anyway. As European Jews start eating falafel, they make this shift because political tension increases. They start attributing falafel to Yemenis who by the 1920s are selling Yemeni and falafel in Yemeni stands in Israel. And falafel is not a food eaten by Muslims or Jews in Yemen, right? So it's kind of a curious twist going here. I wanted to make that clear. So this is a quote from one of the memoirs that I'll talk a little bit more about later. We stopped on this is her first time seeing falafel, right? We stopped on King George Street next to a falafel shop to watch how the seller fried the ball chickpea in oil. The dough of chickpeas looked to me like harish, a kind of grain porridge we cooked in Yemen with a mixture of samna and honey. Sorry, samna is clarified butter. I said to my husband, yeah, let's buy ourselves some harish with samna. Right? So it's quite clear that this is her first time seeing the dish, but this attribution serves a clear ideological purpose. In the words of one author, quote, eating Yemenite could be regarded as an act of bodily identification with the Zionist claim to the land of Israel. And it's worth noting that this assumption, this connection between Yemenis preserving an ancient biblical food practice continues until the present in academic and popular literature. So, for example, Cooper's Eat and Be Satisfied, A Social History of Jewish Food, claims that we can confidently make conclusions about biblical eating based on Yemeni, and in this case also Ethiopian foodways, right? Joe Nathan's cookbook, The Foods of Israel Today, says the closest a modern Jew can come to genuine biblical eating is to attend a holiday meal at the Yemenite home of Rabbi Yosef Tzadok, right? The negative side of this is that marking Yemeni Jews as biblical requires their primordiality, right? It requires that they are static and unchanging biblical figures. Furthermore, this idea is linked to the assumption that Yemen was isolated. And in a sense, then, Yemeni Jews remain outside of history. It's this logic that allows a 1949 documentary to describe Yemeni migration this way. In one night, they spanned more than 1,000 miles and 2,000 years entering the modern world. It also allowed Goitain, perhaps the most venerable scholar of Yemeni Jews, to write that they had, quote, preserved in their remote isolation much of the character of a genuinely Jewish society. And again, this kind of description persists. So, for example, a 2016 article in the Jerusalem Post quotes an American journalist who had been on the airlift that moved Jews from Yemen to Israel, and she describes that airlift as transporting biblical figures. Likewise, a recent Haaretz article quotes Carmela Abder, herself a Yemeni Israeli folklorist, who notes that among Israeli society, Yemeni Jews, quote, have a reputation of being nice Jews, relaxed, and also a community frozen in time that had preserved the culture of Hebrews from the biblical era. And I should say, interestingly, this outlook is also in accord with that of the Yemeni national movement. The Yemeni revolution happens in 1962, and the nationalist movement quite overtly discredits the imamate by claiming that it was isolationist and prevented progress, right? And although Yemeni Jewish collective memory generally reveres Imam Yahya as the protector of the Jewish community, and it's worth thinking about as a research agenda going forward, his assassination in 1948 may be just as important to Jewish migration as the establishment of the State of Israel. But I'll leave that aside for a second. Even though Yemeni Jewish collective memory reveres Imam Yahya, this logic allows Yemeni Jews to embrace their pre-migration culture as authentically Jewish and to imagine migration to Israel as the fulfillment of Jewish history. If Israeli society has seen Yemenis as frozen in time, Yemeni Jews, for their own part, have reinterpreted this idea about their biblicalness, about their religiosity, to argue for full inclusion in the Zionist movement and Israel based on Jewishness. And again, this requires emphasizing Zionism not as a secular national movement, but as one based in religion. Reinterpreted this way, Yemeni Jews could position themselves as the possessors of the most authentic Jewish culture, and as I noted earlier, this could be a contribution to the national project. Yemeni Jews therefore made or sanctioned claims about their biblicalness. For example, the idea that Yemeni Hebrew was the most close to the original pronunciation of the Bible, or the fact that Yemeni Jews ate locust and considered locust kosher in accordance with Leviticus 11:22. So they made these claims, they made claims about sort of biblical culture, and then they could take this biblical material and use it in the creation of something new and modern and Israeli, and they imagine that is their contribution to Israeli society. So for example, Sarah Levi Tanai, the founder and choreographer of the renowned dance group Inbal, claimed that her work was influenced by 5 sources. These are the sources for her dance: Yemeni movement, the Bible, Jewish tradition, Oriental landscape, and modern Israel. Together, these are supposed to form some uniquely Israeli modern form of dance, and unlike European Jewish artists and composers who used Yemeni themes, but as raw materials that had to be westernized, Levi Tanai imagined that what would make Israeli culture unique was its Yemeniness and its tie to the Bible. And you can see here that these sources, right, with the exception maybe of modern Israel, she understands the Yemenis as the best positioned to bring the biblical and the Jewish tradition and the Oriental landscape into the Israeli cultural milieu. Religiosity and biblicalness could not only be used to integrate into Israeli society then, as that example I think shows, or at least to contribute to Israeli society, but could also be used to oppose non-Yemeni religious and state authorities. For example, a Yemeni butcher, in what appears to be a rejection of the Ashkenazi rabbinate's authority to supervise his work, refused to pay a licensing fee, and instead hung up a sign which read, "Slaughterer, working under the supervision of the Almighty." Yehiel Hebshush, whose account of the Awad migration story we started with, came into conflict with the Ashkenazi rabbinate in Tel Aviv because he wanted to import samna, clarified butter, from Yemen in 1950. The rabbis claimed that this food was not kosher and wouldn't give him the certificate. And he insisted instead that if his ancestors considered this food kosher, his community and he would consider them kosher in perpetuity. And he did that on the basis of some sort of Yemeni Jewish authority, right? So Yemeni religiosity then could also serve as a firewall against pressure to assimilate. At the same time that Yemeni narratives use the idea of an unchanging culture, however, they also highlight change. In particular, the adaptation of Yemeni culture, and here Yemeni in quotes, you'll see why in a second, to migration, modernization, and life in Israel. For example, Yemeni women's immigrant memoirs, and here I'm reading 3 memoirs in particular, doing a reading of them, all were published in the first decade of the 21st century. They describe the transformation of local village foodways into a single Yemeni cuisine as the result of migration. In Yemen, cooking styles were defined by town and region, not by national identity. Tzvia Sachar, in her migration memoir, makes a point of highlighting the differences in foods of each area she passed through, particularly the kinds of flour and cooking techniques used for breads. And she tells us in the transit camp on the way to Israel, she learned how to make breads, different kinds of breads from different regions in Yemen. So the homogenization of Yemeni cuisine begins even before arriving in Israel. This process is then amplified in Israel as differences between Yemeni groups were further elided. And sometimes this is stated quite explicitly. This is Mazel Ahag, who says, "Today, the traditional cuisine of Yemeni Jews in Israel is varied with all kinds of baked goods brought from different regions, but in Yemen, each region had its own foods." And note her use there of traditional, which suggests, of course, preservation, while she herself is stressing the newness of a unified Yemeni cuisine. Of course, the standardization of a national or ethnic cuisine is not unique to Yemeni food. Hasia Diner notes the same thing, for example, for Italian food, as immigrants from different parts of Italy gathered in the United States. Nor is this unique to food. Sarah Levi Tanai, who I just mentioned, the choreographer from the dance group Embal, insisted on using immigrant dancers from Yemen as part of a kind of quest for authenticity. She borrowed from the body language, movement, and traditional dances she observed among immigrants from different parts of Yemen, and then combined them into what she called Yemeni dance. But like cuisine, there had really not been a Yemeni dance in Yemen. So she was not so much using authentic movement as creating it. In the case of food, regional specialties like the now ubiquitous jahnun, who some of you might be familiar with, a rolled pastry from parts of southern Yemen, and you can see here it's so prevalent now that not only is it sold in Israeli supermarkets frozen, but it's sort of exported to the rest of the world. First had to be redefined as Yemeni in a national sense, and then could be used to represent Yemeniness in songs and literature. So, for example, Boaz Sharbi's song Sabbath Celebration describes coming home from synagogue on a Saturday morning to a mother serving jahnun and eggs. The protagonist of Jackie McKighton's song Merayuma calls his potential lover jahnun flavored, by which we're to take that she is Yemenite. More recently, Ayelet Tzabari's story Brit Milah uses jahnun to mend a rift between a mother and daughter. So, on one hand, you have this unifying of a Yemeni cuisine. On the other hand, as I stated, memoirists like Issachar and Ahrag make a point of noting when they encountered jahnun for the first time. Ahrag tells us, for example, that in her area of eastern Taiz, they made neither jahnun nor kubane, a northern Yemeni Sabbath specialty. Instead, they made a spongy bread called chafush for the Sabbath. Likewise, they didn't prepare another universal Yemeni-Israeli bread, mulawah. It seems then that these Yemeni women immigrants writing in Israel are aware of the homogenization of Yemeni cuisine and hope to historicize the community's culinary memory. As they note the creation of a Yemeni cuisine, they also describe their encounter with non-Yemeni foods. Several memoirs describe difficulty adjusting to these new foods. So, for example, Yemeni Jews did not know or like olives before they arrived in Israel. This is Naomi Habara's description of foods in the Ein Shemer immigrant camp. Here she says, "We didn't recognize all the food items we received. For example, when they gave us olives, we immediately threw them in the garbage. The immigrants called the olives bar, goat dung, because they looked like black circles and they weren't used to seeing these strange things in the food." Well, make of that as you will. Sometimes the displeasure was even more visceral. Here again is Mazal Ahrag, who says, "On top of the suffering of being in a refugee camp, it was hard to adjust to the different foods they served us and to the necessity of giving up the Yemeni foods that we were used to. One day I saw a woman take a slice of bread, spread helba on it. Helba is a fenugreek paste, I guess we'll call it, and then spread tuna on top of that. I was disgusted just seeing it, and I threw up. I thought I was going to die, so I stopped going to breakfast, and day by day I got skinnier until I was skin and bone." In both cases, revulsion caused by new foods is in stark contrast to the picturesque descriptions memoirists give of their villages and foods in Yemen. For example, Habara begins her memoir describing Souk al-Athnain, her village, as a beautiful area, green and lush. She reminisces about picking dum fruit and stalks of sorghum with her grandmother and provides an extensive list of all the kinds of fruits and vegetables that her father and neighbors grew. Likewise, Issachar recalls the big round pita bread of her village that was so delicious it could be eaten plain, and the abundance of meat that her family ate. After migration, by contrast, she describes the food she took to work as dry slices of bread with jelly. It's noteworthy also that she and the other memoirists use the word pita, a decidedly un-Yemeni word, to describe a variety of breads, indicating that their culinary terminology has been impacted by migration. Women's memoirs also describe adopting new foodways as part of a process of becoming Israeli and modern. Issachar, who was separated from her mother and taken to a school for immigrant children, depicts the cafeteria as a site of observation and discipline. After a while, he saw and understood we weren't used to Western food, and he began to teach us how to eat and what to eat. Slowly, we started to eat, but we didn't like it, and we didn't dare eat everything. She was later moved to another school, but there the same process was at work. At lunch, the teachers monitored the cafeteria, quote, to see who didn't know how to eat and who didn't eat well, end quote. And knowing how to eat here clearly means assimilating Western dining manners, such as using a knife and fork. And of course, this was in keeping with a larger transformation which required that the Yemenis adopt Western behaviors to become Israeli. At times, Issachar's tone is defensive. For example, she notes, quote, Northern Yemen is described as a backward place from the perspective of the cultural concepts of the 20th century, but it's very rich in its own traditions and culture. Hubara likewise describes her encounter with the modern ambivalently. In the period immediately following immigration, she continued to bake traditional breads that she'd learned how to make as a child, even going so far as to buy unground flour so the recipes would come out correctly. She describes her pita as better than the strange bread that she was given in Israel. But despite this, she says, quote, we didn't continue with the pita for a long time because we quickly got used to the modern food in Israel. And note again here her use of the word modern as a descriptor for Israeli breads. Hubara and her family, it seems, felt compelled to adjust to new foods, even if they preferred those they were used to eating in Yemen. And in fact, a 1958 survey of Yemeni women indicates just that. Cooking, they said, was easier in Israel, but they preferred the taste of food in Yemen. And that, of course, means that this transformation in Yemeni foodways was accompanied by a loss of pleasure in food. Her description of her culinary education is also quite revealing. Quote, the Yemeni woman remembered the entire process of cooking and baking by conveying this knowledge and experience from mother to daughter, and thus tradition continued from generation to generation. I also learned to cook from my mother, and only in Israel I went at some point to study home economics, cooking, and baking. Of course, I also learned to cook the customary dishes in the Israeli kitchen. She doesn't elaborate further, but the contrast between transfer of knowledge from mother to daughter with classes in home economics indicates, again, a kind of defensiveness and an acceptance of the superiority of what we might call the science of cooking. Despite nostalgia for the foods of her village, by the time Hubara has her own children, she has completely adopted these modern food habits. She tells us that her morning routine is to make sandwiches for the kids to take to school using whatever leftovers are in the fridge. After that, she makes them soft-boiled eggs and serves them in special egg cups she bought for the children. She serves these with toast spread with margarine, butter, or cheese. Yemeni food by this point, then, has shifted from the food of every day to an ethnically marked food served on holidays or the Sabbath, specifically as part of a strategy of remembering. The everyday foods, sandwiches, toast with margarine, are foods of convenience, but also mark the author as having accepted modern Israeli culture. Writing about the Greek island Kalymnos, David Sutton has suggested that the structure and repetition of food habits, both quotidian foodways and holiday and ritual foods, create food memories as a form of historical consciousness. But in this case, the everyday foods and the ritual foods seem to be moving in different directions. As everyday foods veer towards Western, Yemeni food itself is ritualized. And if Western food is modern and national, Yemeni is ethnic. Maybe this splits the historical consciousness. Though earlier Hubara, like the other memoirists, had described food in Yemen as regionally distinct, she soon comes to talk about Yemeni tradition as a single entity. At the end of her memoir, speaking about a ceremony to honor the women of her moshav, she applauds the hard work of Yemeni mothers in Israel, who she says, quote, stand in the kitchen from morning to evening without complaint and serve their husbands and children food, the soup and helba and warm pita. So gone are the idealistic descriptions of food in Yemen, and while she had defined celebratory food in Souq al-Ithnain by the presence of roasted meat and wine, she now employs an Israeli understanding of a typical Yemeni food, a generalizable Yemeni soup. Hubara notes that she hopes that the daughters of these Yemeni women will, quote, follow them in maintaining the Yemeni traditions for coming generations, end quote. But it seems that only a single flattened Yemeni identity can be maintained in the space allowed for Israeli ethnic difference. If so, her call for maintaining tradition is really about preserving the new. And though her memoir clearly states that she's clear that Yemeni Jews must embrace modern Israeli culture, how the ethnic and the modern will be reconciled is never really clarified. Okay, so far we've seen different ways that the preservation of tradition functions in Ashkenazi narratives and Yemeni Jewish memory. And in my last example, I want to shift gears a little bit and turn to Yemeni song to look at how it's been used by Yemeni Jews in Israel, but also by Yemeni Muslims in what I think is an increasingly important call for common Yemeni Muslim Jewish collective memory. In Israel, Yemeni poetry and song have long been used as evidence of yearning for the land of Israel. For example, this is the beginning of Ahavat Hadassah, which is sometimes described as Shalom Shabazi's most celebrated poem. Shalom Shabazi is the most important Yemeni Jewish poet, maybe, from the 17th century, and interpreters generally believe that Hadassah refers here to the land of Israel, sometimes the divine presence. And I thought I would just play you a very short portion of this. This is Aharon Amram singing. Of time, I've stopped it there, but you can get a sense here of the soundscape, but also I think the lyrics here are clear, right? They're interpreted as the love for the land of Israel, lamentations about exile, and claiming that if possible, the singer would return to the gates of Zion. And Reuven Aharoni, an important Yemeni Jewish scholar, says, quote, Shabazi gives utterance to his people's profound yearnings for Zion. But as a historical analysis, I think this is quite problematic. It's clear that Shabazi's poetry was written in response to specific political events in Yemen during the reigns of Imam Ismail and Imam al-Mahdi Ahmed during the 17th century, which Yosef Tobi, a Yemeni historian, describes as one of the harshest eras in Yemeni Jewish history. If those imams were particularly oppressive, Shabazi's work allowed Yemeni Jews to imagine, quote, a future where true reality is reversed and where the people of Israel will rule over the enemy. Toby eventually links this imagination to a redemptive migration to Israel, concluding his article with the claim that, quote, that Yemeni Jews were, quote, eventually to be delivered and go up to the land of their forefathers. But he doesn't quite explain how the 17th century is linked to the 20th, and his own analysis makes it clear that these poems are primarily a call for Jewish perseverance at the time they were written. That said, Aharoni and Toby's analysis does fit with the current belief of the Yemeni community in Israel as it continues to sing these songs. Shabazi's poems have shifted in meaning with the move to Israel and are now understood as proof of an original Yemeni Jewish Zionism, like many of the other examples that I've given you. But if we take these expressions of longing for Zion seriously, how then do we understand the clear longing for Yemen apparent in contemporary Yemeni Jewish popular music? Take, for example, the songs of Zion Golan, who is perhaps the most well-known performer of traditional songs in Israel. Traditional Yemeni songs in Israel. Many of his songs express longing or love for Yemen and describe it explicitly as his homeland. For example, the song Sana Yemen, the chorus of the song is, Sana is my country, I wish you were close, my country, my love. Another song, Yemen, Yemen, states, Yemen, Yemen, the best of places, it has beauty and all the happiness. Later in the song, the lyrics even attribute the beauty of Yemen to the policies of Imam Yahya, who ruled the country until his death in 1948. Imam Yahya protected you, Golan sings. And there are so many examples of this in Yemeni music recorded in Israel that I'm going to stop there, but the list could go on and on. There's song names, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Should these be taken to represent a desire to return to Yemen? In fact, in both academic analysis and social media discussion, Yemeni Muslims have taken these lyrics and the continued performance of Yemeni music as evidence of Jewish loyalty and patriotism to Yemen. For example, Al-Shami's book, Yahud al-Yemen, includes a large section on Yemeni Jewish song and states that Yemeni culture in Israel is, quote, more authentic than that of any other Jewish group. And he emphasizes specifically the preservation of traditional song and Yemeni dialect. Likewise, Yemeni Jewish songs on YouTube have become important sites for Yemeni Muslim-Jewish interaction and are a particularly productive place to think about memory. The comment section of YouTube is full of debates about Jewish history in Yemen, Muslim-Jewish coexistence, patriotism to Yemen, and the Yemeni Jewish relationship to Zionism. Again, using Zion Golan as an example here, and that's because he's not only the most important Yemeni singer in Israel, but also very popular in Yemen. And an analysis of his comment section, and here I should say I took the first 50 hits that come up on YouTube when you search for Zion Golan and scraped the comments so that I could do a closer reading of them and an analysis. An analysis of the comment section underscores the importance of these themes and brings to light some interesting questions about shared Yemeni identity. A large number of comments highlight Muslim-Jewish coexistence, both historically and in the present, and link this to the existence of a shared Yemeni culture. There are, of course, negative comments, but these are more infrequent. And just to make that clear, I divided them into two categories: expressions of love and hate, and expressions of love were 9.8 times more likely than those of hate. Some examples. Komeva88, who I'm guessing by her posting pattern is a Yemeni Jew in Israel, responds to comments by Yemeni Arab Muslim users saying, quote, "I'm glad we share love for Tzion's songs and the love of our beloved Yemen." And I should say these are direct quotes, so the English sometimes is a little funny. People of Yemeni descent from locations as distant as Southeast Asia, Dubai, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States send, quote, "peace and love to one another." Ana Yemeni 99 writes, "I'm a Yemeni Muslim, but I love this artist insanely. I feel he has more patriotism and pride in Yemen than we do. Greetings to all of Yemen, Muslims and Jews. We are all brothers." A user from Southeast Asia is more explicit in defining this in diasporic terms. "We are diaspora everywhere. I listen to every Yemeni descent singer, no matter Jews or Muslims. You're all my pride." Commenters regularly say things like, "We are proud of you, keep it up," and several asked Tzion Golan to perform in Yemen. One, Adnan Sayadi, says, "One day," and this explicitly links us to the idea of moving back to Yemen, right? "One day you will come back, inshallah, and we'll be there waiting to welcome you all and live there proud to be Yemeni. Ya Yemen, ya Ajmal Watan, Yemen, one nation." Kuntzman and Raji, in an article about the Israel Loves Iran and Iran Loves Israel Facebook campaigns, have noted a similar phenomena. Their title, "Israelis and Iranians Get a Room," signals how exaggerated these assertions of mutual love and respect sometimes become, and they warn that this language may serve to obscure the violence in Middle Eastern politics, and they're particularly concerned with violence in Palestine. In their case, however, declarations of love and admiration are between people who don't think of themselves as a single ethnic group. In the case I'm describing, it's quite different. Yemeni Jews and Muslims on YouTube are asserting a shared history and even a diasporic connection, one both threatened and romanticized by the absence of most of the Yemeni Jewish community of Yemen for the last 70 years. By 1950, most of the Yemeni Jewish community had emigrated out of Yemen. Yemeni Muslim-Jewish interaction, or direct interaction, I should say, became rare. In addition, most of the mechanisms that theorists of imagined communities would consider important are not operable for these two groups. Yemeni Jews, second and third Yemeni Jews in Israel generally don't speak Arabic well, are not connected to Yemen, don't read the Yemeni or Arabic press. They listen to different radio stations and TV stations than Yemenis in Yemen. So in other words, the communities have in some real sense become separated. On the other hand, in both Israel and Yemen, there has been a great deal of nostalgia for the Jewish presence in Yemen. And conversely, because most Jews left by 1950s, they can now be posited as authentically Yemeni, preservers of a culture untouched by the outside influences that naturally impact the real Yemen. Music has been a particularly important arena for expressing this nostalgia. For Yemeni Jews in Israel, it's a mechanism to prevent assimilation and maintain a specifically Yemeni identity. For Yemeni Muslims, Jewish music can represent an authentic Yemen, and conversely, by highlighting Jewish presence, is in accord with liberal secular ideas of multiculturalism, so marking Yemen as modern. And of course, it's important that these conversations are happening online. Cyberspace has allowed Yemenis in Israel and Yemen, who had largely been cut off from one another, to communicate directly again. When they do so, a large number express a shared love for Yemen, but also different ideas of patriotism, often in the same song. So for example, these are comments on one song. "I love you, Yemen," writes one user of YouTube. Another writes, "There is no equal to Yemen," to which another responds, "I love you, Tzion Golan, God bless Israel." In response to one user declaring a song the most patriotic Yemeni song I ever heard, another user insists, "Except Tzion Golan is Israeli." These different loyalties clearly reflect differences in users' interpretations of Tzion Golan's ethnic identity. Many ask if he's Jewish or Arab, some assert that he's an Arab Jew, and others stress his Israeliness. While some Arab users ask why he sings in Arabic if he's Jewish, others highlight his use of dialect as a mark of authenticity. So here's one user saying, "He speaks San'ani as if he lives with us inside the old city of Sana'a, wondering how he could speak and sing that fluent when he speaks Hebrew days and nights in Israel. Tzion Golan is talented, and I'm sure he loves Yemen too much. I wish to meet him." In fact, Golan's preservation of Yemeni heritage and his loyalty to Yemen, often expressed as wataniya by Arabic users, are important recurring themes. Over and over, comments refer to his authenticity and preservation. Occasionally, they're part of an almost formulaic statement like, I like the song despite that the singer is Jewish. And there's a full range of comments about his Jewishness, ranging from suggestions that he convert to Islam to assertions of love and brotherhood between all Yemenis regardless of religion. The confusion over Golan's Yemeni Jewish Israeli identity is complicated by the use of Yemeni place names in some songs and references to Israel in others. Song titles like Yemen, Yemen, Aden, and Sana'a certainly suggest an attachment to and longing for Yemen. Ambiguity in the singer's use of the term biladi, my country or my homeland, further complicates this picture. While the song Sana'a al-Yemen that I mentioned earlier specifically designates the city as his bilad, Sana'i biladi, another song, a medley called Biladi Biladi, is more, my country, is more ambiguous. Some lyrics describe an environment that sounds like Yemen. Then the lyrics, my country, you are far away, push this ambiguity further because it's not clear whether this is a traditional song from Yemen or one composed in Israel. The idea that this is Yemen then seems confirmed later in the medley when a lyrical actor enters Sana'a to look for his lover. A second song called Biladi, however, describes the waters of Jerusalem and designates the land of Zion, of Zion, as his country. Ard Zion hi Biladi. This prompts a long debate among users which takes place for a few years. You know the Jew means the country of Israel. Another says, no, on the contrary, he's singing about Yemen because he in the end is Yemeni, and every Yemeni Jew loves Yemen and extols it always. Another writes, no, he says, Ard Zion hi Biladi. His Bilad is Zion, equal sign, means the land of Israel. To which another responds, I know, but he means Eretz Zion and Teman. He means the land of Zion and Yemen. One writes, the dude is Israeli. Why would anyone call him Yemeni for? No recognition to the Zionists until justice found its place in Palestine. And another finally agrees, Biladik is not here, fucker, but nice song. Zionism and conflict in Palestine thus reinsert themselves into the question of Yemeni Jewish identity. This debate is exacerbated by the linguistic coincidence that the most famous Yemeni Jewish singer in Israel is named Zion or Zion. Several Arab users ask about this. Others respond by explaining that his name as shown in Arabic is a transliteration of Zion and that it would be translated Sahyun in Arabic and that it's an Israeli name. Some users are surprised by this. One, for example, says, by God, you are right. The people think Zion, they don't know the translation is Zion. Others try to explain the etymology of the word Zion in order to decouple it from Zionist ideology. And of course, Yemeni Israeli commenters by and large declare themselves Zionist and Yemenis. The issue of Zionism in Israel came to the fore again this past summer when Zion Golan was invited to Jordan to perform at a Yemeni wedding with the Yemeni Muslim singer Hussein Muhib. This was his first performance in a contemporary Yemeni setting, and it's clear from the videos of the event that the Yemeni Muslim audience was happy to see him and familiar with his recordings. The two singers performed a combination of traditional Yemeni songs and Zion Golan songs, and watching the audience sing along indicates clearly that even those written by Zion Golan or for him in Israel have entered the general Yemeni repertoire. Likewise, the performance of traditional songs invoking God or spiritual themes suggests the possibility of a shared religious tradition. And here I wanted to play a very short clip of this, just so you get a sense of this, and the lyrics are up here. And maybe I should underscore how remarkable this is, meaning Zion Golan, a prominent Yemeni family, has a wedding in Jordan and decides to invite both Hussein Muhib, an important Yemeni singer, and Zion Golan from Israel to perform at the wedding, right? That's kind of remarkable. And watching Golan and Muhib sing songs like Mustajib together, and you could see you saw the clear sort of spiritual nature of the lyrics, consciously or not call or invoke a shared religious tradition, right? There were some negative reactions to this on social media, censoring both the organizers and Muhib for supposed normalization with Israel. But the majority of YouTube comments fit into the themes of coexistence and patriotism that I described earlier. The shared musical tradition, and in this case the literal coming together of a Muslim and Jewish singer, are used to highlight a shared history, coexistence, and to declare love for all Yemenis regardless of religion. Likewise, despite Golan's explicit claim that he doesn't deal with politics, his Yemeni Arabic singing is understood by many of those who commented on this performance as a manifestation of patriotism. This, however, is where the use of these songs among Jews and Muslims diverge. Yemeni Jews sing these songs and invoke memories of Yemen as a form of ethnic preservation and pride, but don't see these as opposed to Zionism or Israeli identity. Likewise, longing for Yemen is interpreted differently by the two groups. For the Jewish users, this is a desire to reconnect with Yemen itself and perhaps to visit, while for Yemeni Muslims, there's often a call attached here for a permanent Jewish return to a former homeland. Okay, so I know I'm coming to the end of this. The cases that I've described today all present us with Yemeni-Israeli actors remembering Yemen in ambivalent ways. All are at least partially at odds with Zionist ideology and historical narrative, although the storytellers themselves likely consider themselves loyal Israelis and Zionists. Habshush's invocation of Awad's migration is intended to encourage Israeli Yordim, those who have left Israel, to return. But the story he tells of Jewish return to Yemen forces us to rethink Yemeni Jewish history and to decenter the place of Zion and Israel in Yemeni migration before the 20th century. My reading of the three Yemeni Jewish women's memoirs highlight two contradictions. All accept that migration to Israel requires a change in Yemeni foodways and other traditions, but also indicate a loss of pleasure in food, and all call for the preservation of Yemeni foodways and traditions, while their own narratives make it clear that the idea of a single Yemeni tradition is a major transformation resulting from migration. Yemeni Hebrew lyrics lamenting the condition of exile and longing for Zion have been understood generally as a kind of proto-Zionism, but these poems were written in particular historical contexts and present the concerns of their own times, not those of the 20th century. I think it's doubtful that they would have been understood as a call for return to the land of Israel until the late 19th century at the earliest. But their meaning has in fact changed, and Yemeni Jews now understand them as foreshadowing a return to the land of Israel. If that is their meaning, then how should we understand longing for Yemen present in innumerable songs written in modern Israel? Are these two expressing a desire to return? And in fact, as I said, Yemeni Muslims have sometimes understood them just that way. Zion Golan's longing for Yemen is real, but it's the longing of a diasporic subject for a connection to an imagined homeland. Perhaps that in and of itself unsettles the traditional Zionist historical narrative, but it should not be taken as a rejection of Israel or Zionism. These contradictory interpretations are the result of different demands being made on Yemeni Jewish identity. Israeli society has demanded that Yemeni Jews become Israeli and has allowed only for a limited space for the preservation of pre-migration cultures. Yemeni Muslims, on the other hand, often claim that authentic Yemeniness is in opposition to Israeli identity. Yemeni Jews caught between these positions have embraced Israeliness, but hope to remain Yemeni at the same time. And up until now, I think they, or we, have been largely successful. But it remains to be seen if this will continue going forward. There is some reason to be pessimistic, as I've noted. Again, second and third generation Yemenis generally don't know Arabic well, have very limited contact with Yemen. But it makes me hopeful that in areas like the ones I've described, in foodways and music, younger Yemeni Jews continue to insist on the performance of a transformed Yemeni culture. And I certainly hope that that endures. Thank you.